Welcome to this Killick Explains video and welcome to number 2 in my How to Generate an Income series. And this one, number 2, is all about using bonds. Now, why am I talking about generating income? I'm going to open all 4 videos in this series with these lines, if you like. Well, first of all, the obvious reason, in an inflationary environment, people are looking for ways to generate income if they can, for day-to-day living purposes. And of course, anybody who's post-work or is dialing down work needs to replace the income they normally receive from their employer or out from self-employment. So there is an interest in income. The question is, could bonds provide it? So let's take a look at the pros and cons and then some additional information sources right at the end as normal. So what is a bond? In a nutshell, I cover this in more detail elsewhere, but it's a tradable IOU issued by companies and governments at varying risk levels. Governments, not all of them, tend to be fairly safe if you're talking about the US and the UK. Companies, quite a few of them are quite safe, but some of them are not and could go bust. But nonetheless, issued by companies and governments, there's quite a wide range of them out there. The income is usually fixed, all right, so there's normally a percentage of what's called the bond's nominal value, like 3% or 6%, paid to the holder, but it can also float. So you can get bonds, fewer of them, by the way, out there, where the return that you get in income terms can vary. All right, now, so what's in it for an investor? Well, basically, there is the potential to generate what's called an income yield, i.e. get a stable fixed income from one of these things paid on a regular basis, and also the possibility of a capital gain or loss. So unlike a bank account, these things are traded in a secondary market, as it's called. The price can move around, and therefore to get the full picture as an investor on what you're getting annually, you need a yield that combines any income and any capital gain or loss. More about that coming up in a moment. So what are the advantages of investing in these corporate or government IOUs? Well, they're relatively price stable. Now I say relatively, it does depend on what you buy. They carry different levels of risk, but a government IOU issued by a stable government such as the UK and or the US will tend to be reasonably price stable. It's not like a cash account. It's not like it will never change in value, but reasonably price stable. Yields tend to be better than those available on pure cash deposits. So that's quite important. And if you've got a portfolio of these things, you can blend them together to generate a yield which might help in the fight against inflation, even if it doesn't get you all the way there. And as I mentioned, the return can be structured to be fixed or floating or a mixture of the two, but in most cases it's fixed, and that's because most of these IOUs carry fixed coupons, and they do that because issuers want to know what they are committing to as much as investors want to know what they're going to get in return. And there's a known return if you hold them all the way through to maturity. What does that mean, Tim? It just means that unlike a share, for example, which is almost like a permanent investment that will float out there until a company is dissolved almost, a bond, most IOUs have a fixed maturity date, so you can therefore map what your return is going to look like between now and then. And you can map it to the pound, if you like. And as long as an issuer doesn't go bust in the meantime, you pretty much know from a fixed income security what the deal is, what's on the table. And I should mention there are tax benefits if a bond is what's known as qualifying. Cover that in more detail elsewhere, but log that thought. Now, it all sounds okay so far, but what are the challenges? One of them is jargon. People feel less comfortable for some reason with bonds than perhaps they do with cash and shares. There are bits of terminology I'll mention in a moment which are quite important and do put people off, unnecessarily sometimes. There are some risks. Issuers of bonds can go bust in the corporate space in particular. Prices can move around. It's not a totally risk-free investment, but chosen carefully, it can be pretty low risk. So there's counterparty risk. There's term risk, by which I mean somebody who's buying bonds on your behalf needs to look through all the detail, the small print, just make sure there aren't any funnies coming up in the future. And there's a thing called duration. Now, some people might be getting nervous already about bond jargon, but duration simply, very simply, expresses the sensitivity of a bond's yield to a change in interest rates. How volatile is it in a nutshell? It's quite an important number, and you don't need to have the science to understand the concept. Another thing to watch out for is there's no way of directly accessing bonds really as a retail investor. So the options tend to be, in terms of getting in, a fund or a portfolio. And there are pros and cons to both. If you like visibility, you like a bit of a say over what's under the bonnet, then a portfolio put together on your behalf can work better than a fund, but I wouldn't like to sway you too far in either direction here. And what are we going to use bonds for? All right, we're not going to be buying single bonds. That's a bad idea, like buying single shares. What are we going to use a bond fund or a portfolio for? Emergency cash, probably not. All right, because liquidating these things may not be straightforward, and if you liquidate them before maturity, you don't always know what you're going to get back. Foreseeable calls on capital, absolutely. Here you've got a thing that offers an income up to a known point in the future. Well, that could coincide with when you think you might need to spend some money. So potentially there is a way to match bonds or bond portfolios to those known further out calls on your capital resources. And as for long-term investment portfolios, of course, they can definitely play a role in there as a counterweight, depending on your risk profile, depending on what you're trying to achieve, as a counterweight to, say, your equity exposure. Yes, definitely. So quite a few ways they could be used successfully, but it is worth getting on top of the jargon, and there is a bit more jargon than there is with a pure cash account, and to some degree with shares. Now, if you want to know more about that jargon, Killik.com/learn is my comprehensive video library, and there are bonds videos in there. And if you'd like to read all about it, there's normally a fixed income section in Confident, our quarterly magazine, editor at Killik.com, or you'll find bonds mentioned in the context of building an income for time after work and generating an income once you stop work. And there are 2 guides available on those 2 topics. Again, editor at Killik.com.